Hey guys, welcome to my first monthly wrap-up for the month of August. I've got 8 books here to talk about that I read this month, so I hope you enjoy, and let's get started. As I said, I read 8 books this month, which is pretty good for me. I only read 3 the previous month, but that was because I was preoccupied with a big boy, which I finished this month, which we'll get to. So I guess let's just start with the first one. A lot of these books that I read were from the library, so I don't have physical copies of them on me, but a few of them I do, so we'll just go through them. The first book that I read in August was We Need New Stories, The Myths That Subvert Freedom by Nesrine Malik. She's a British-Nigerian columnist who I believe writes for The Guardian. So it's basically a short book of essays about the myths that subvert American freedom. Basically, a lot of the arguments that right-wing people tend to have about the downfall of America, like the myth of political correctness, the myth of gender equality, things like that. I don't want to get into politics too much because I'm not a political scientist, I'm not an expert, but I thought it was a very fascinating book. I thought it was very clearly written. It doesn't get bogged down in sort of academic language or complex theories or anything like that. It's very much just simple, clear-minded, persuasive essays, and I thought they were all very interesting. But I really enjoyed them, and I thought they had a lot of interesting things to say about racism and gender inequality, a lot of things that I hadn't really considered before on ways to kind of think about your own prejudices and how they might manifest, even if you're not necessarily, hardcore conservative or bigoted or whatever. So it was an interesting book. I can't go into a deep dive on it because I'm not smart enough to do so, but it was an engaging read, and it was short, so it didn't take me long to get through, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. The second book I read this month was They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. This is a sort of YA, I guess you'd call it a science fiction novel, where it takes place in present day, but it's an alternate version of present day, where somehow we've discovered a way to detect when people are going to die. We don't know when or how they're going to die, but we know the date of their death. So there's this service called Deathcast that calls people and informs them, hey, today is your last day, our condolences, etc., etc. So it's about these 2 young boys, Matteo and Rufus, who both receive their calls on the same day, and they end up meeting through this app called Last Friend that's meant to connect people who have received their calls and who are experiencing their last day and want somebody to connect with. And so it follows them throughout their last day and the sort of growing relationship that develops between them. I read this for my book club, which we were supposed to meet up this weekend, but that didn't happen, but we've postponed it, so we will meet up eventually. But I read this for that, and I've never read Adam Silvera before. I don't read a lot of YA. People who know me know I don't read a lot of YA. And I had a few problems with the book. Some of the writing felt a little bit juvenile. Some of the dialogue was a little wonky, but that was mostly in the beginning of the book. Once it got into the story and it got into the characters, I actually found myself really swept up in it, surprisingly. Matteo is an adorable cinnamon roll, and I love him, and I related to a lot of the feelings that he felt about sort of living your life and what does it mean to live? How do you live your life? And what regrets do you have now that you know you're not going to see the future, There was definitely some very emotional parts. I was surprised how emotionally affected I was by the story, especially the ending. I was pleasantly surprised. So I look forward to hopefully eventually reading more of Adam Silvera's stuff. We'll see. The third book I read this month was Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This is, again, a young adult historical fiction novel about that takes as its basis the true story of the sinking of a German ship during wartime called the Wilhelm Gustloff. And it's about these 4 people who basically end up becoming involved with each other and end up together on this ship, and how their lives and missions sort of intersect. I'd heard a lot of good things about this on BookTube, and I was looking forward to reading it, and to be honest, when I finished it, it just kind of left me feeling kind of eh. And I don't really know why, because I didn't have a problem with the writing. There was some beautiful writing in it. There was a lot of really captivating themes about, goodness and kindness and sort of national identity and, being a marginalized person. I thought that the historical details felt very lived in, very well researched. But something about it just didn't work for me. I thought it ended very. I thought the ending felt a little bit too not fairy tale, but it felt a little bit too like nicely wrapped up. And none of the characters really grabbed me. I liked some of them. The character Florian I thought was really interesting. He was a Prussian soldier who was fleeing the Nazis with stolen treasure, and he is given this kind of like mythical status by one of the younger girls, who's also a character in the novel, who thinks of him as like this epic knight from like one of her old stories, and I really enjoyed that. But other than that, like none of the characters really came together for me. There's a Nazi character in the book who's a protagonist who started off interesting, but then I felt like he became a little bit too one-note and generic kind of psychotic Nazi bad guy. So, I don't know, it just didn't really work for me. It was also kind of sold to me as like Titanic, but in World War II, and it wasn't really that. I mean, they don't even get on the boat until around 2/3 of the way through the book, and once they're on the boat, everything else happens very quickly. So I never really got a sense of any of that sort of aspect of it. So, I don't know. It just didn't really work for me. I ended up giving it 2 stars, so sorry. I know a lot of people really liked that book, but it didn't do it for me. The 4th book I read was The Silver Scar by Betsy Dornbusch. I'd never heard of this before. My friend Nakia just ran across it at the library, and she sent me it, and it sounded really weird and interesting, so I just picked it up. It's a post-apocalyptic fantasy novel, I guess you'd say, that takes place in the far future in Boulder, Colorado, I believe. And it's about a spiritual war between Wiccans and Christians. Although, of course, being that this is a future post-apocalypse, it's not Wiccans or Christians as we would think of them. The main character is this ex-Wiccan archwarden named Trinidad, who has been training his whole life to become, you know, this messenger of God, this archwarden, this warrior, this spiritual warrior. And he ends up running into an old friend of his named Castell, who is a Wiccan eco-terror, or an eco-terrorist, which is sort of a splinter group of sort of the Wiccan faith that, you know, are eco-terrorists who blow up things, you know, that they feel is, you know, you get it. And there's this bishop named Bishop Marius, who's this older woman who's hell-bent on starting a spiritual crusade to basically wipe out all of the Wiccans. And it's about how Castell and Trinidad come together despite kind of their long history together and their opposing viewpoints to sort of stop her from, you know, mass murder. I thought it was really interesting. It was the world was very compelling. The world building, I thought, was really, really good. You got a lot of a sense of what was going on without tons and tons of info dumps. It was a clear, easy to read writing style, and there was a lot of interesting themes about sort of faith and religion and spirituality, and, you know, like what makes something spiritually correct. Like there's a lot of stuff about guilt, you know, because Trinidad is dealing with his guilt over having Wiccan eco-terror parents. Things like that. There's a lot of that sort of stuff that was really, really interesting. It didn't quite come together for me at the end. I liked it, but I felt like some of the characters were not that great, not that well developed. I mean, they were interesting. There was an interesting basis there, but none of them really sort of jumped off the page for me. There's a queer romance in the book that didn't really feel. It just kind of came out of nowhere. It didn't really feel earned to me. So I have sort of mixed feelings about it, but I do think it was a really interesting book, and I do softly recommend it if it sounds interesting to you, especially because Betsy Dornbusch is an unknown author. I'd never heard of her before. It's only got 36 ratings on Goodreads, so, you know, I like supporting obscure authors like that, so if that sounds interesting to you, I'd say check it out. The 5th book I read was Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding. I know, laugh at me, it's chick lit, whatever, but I was just really in the mood for like some 90s era sort of British literature, sort of dealing with that kind of like urban ennui, I guess you'd say, of like, you know, living in, you know, England or London in this case. If you guys have seen the movie, you know what this is about. It's about a woman named Bridget Jones, and it's her diary that she keeps over the course of a year as she basically struggles with life and relationships, her career, and all that stuff. To be honest, it didn't really do it for me. It was okay at first, but but as it got closer to sort of the midpoint, I sort of realized, like, there wasn't a whole lot of there just wasn't a whole lot of substance to it. There was some funny, like, humorous moments. Helen Fielding has that very dry British humor that I enjoy. But if you sort of strip away all of that, it's basically just a very generic romantic comedy where, you know, she goes off with one guy and then the other guy, you know, that guy doesn't work out. So then she meets this other guy who's, like, way better for her, and they have a much better relationship. And I don't know, it was just, and there was a lot of the humor in the book sort of arose out of that kind of sad millennial thing, you know, or it's like, oh, like, everyone's going to parties and nobody likes me, nobody invites me anywhere, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. But she didn't really do anything with it. And maybe that's because the book, it was published in 1996, and it was kind of the progenitor of that whole sort of subgenre, I guess you'd say, of chick lit, or whatever you want to call it, you know, disillusioned young women, you know, I don't know. It didn't interest me. It didn't hold my attention. I mean, I finished it because it was very short, but it was just, I don't know, I didn't like it, and I only ended up giving it 2 stars. So, I mean, I'm sorry. I know, like, a lot of people love it. It was recommended highly to me. It wasn't quite what I was looking for, and I'm sorry about that. Then the 6th book I read this month was Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell. I borrowed this from my friend Nakia. This is the first book in a 6-part series, I believe, published by Orbit. I've heard a little bit of Sebastian de Castell. He wrote the Greatcoat series, which I've heard a lot of good things about. But my friend Nakia recommended this to me. It basically takes place in this world where there's spellcasters named Shatep, who are like they're the high class citizens. They rule everything, and there's a sort of an underclass of people known as Jantep who don't have magic, and they sort of live as, you know, second class citizens. They tend to be servants or, you know, menial labor, that kind of thing. And the main character is Helen, who's the son of a very prominent spellcaster. Who is desperate to discover his magic, but his magic hasn't manifested itself yet, and so he's basically freaking out about potentially becoming Jantep and being exiled, essentially. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's all I'll say. But it took me a while to get into. The writing was really good. It was very straightforward and very, like, action heavy and very adventurous feeling, and the dialogue's really funny. It has kind of a sort of a buddy comedy vibe to it, and there's this mentor character named Farius Parfax who uses, like, playing cards as weapons, and there's a lot of really cool stuff like that. It just took me a while to get into because I think there wasn't anything sort of special about it that was, like, super grabbing me at first. But the more that I got into the story, and especially once I reached the last act of the book, it really picked up, and I really got into it. I mean, the world was interesting without being too complex. The dialogue was fun. And the ending was, like, super entertaining, to the point where as soon as I finished the book, I went and got the second book from the library, so I'll be reading that soon, hopefully. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was a masterpiece or anything, but if you're looking for, like, a fun, adventurous, you know, kind of not silly. It's somewhat light. There are some darker themes, but for the most part, it's very lighthearted, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty fun. I gave it 4 stars, 3.5, 4 stars. So I would recommend that, and I'm looking forward to the next book in the series, seeing how that turns out. The 7th book I read was Doll Bones by Holly Black. This is a children's horror novel that was published in 2013. I've read a little bit of Holly Black before. I read The Darkest Part of the Forest, which I really enjoyed. And this is the second book I've read by her now, and I also really, really enjoyed it. Basically, it's about 3 friends who all play this game together with, like, dolls and action figures that they just sort of refer to obliquely as the game. It's almost like a really elaborate form of playing pretend. It's not quite D&D, not quite LARPing. You know, they come up with all these, like, elaborate stories and characters and take them on these, like, wild adventures and stuff. But they're getting older. They're 12 in the book, so they're getting older. And one of the main characters, Zach, his father throws out all of his toys, and basically, you know, as basically a way of trying to get him to grow up, you know, and stop playing with dolls and all that stuff. And there's this creepy doll that they refer to as the Queen, who's, like, this big part of their game, that is owned by one of the other characters' parents. And basically, after his father throws his toys out, Zach decides to sort of distance himself from his other two friends. But then they approach him one night saying that the doll spoke to them and that she has the ashes and bones of a dead girl inside of them that demand to be buried or she'll haunt them, basically. And so it's about this adventure that they go on together to basically bury the bones, to bury the doll bones. Yeah, I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It's for younger readers, so I mean, you don't expect like, I don't know, high literature or whatever. It's not, an amazingly beautiful prose style. But the thing that I really loved about it was that, it was a little bit spooky, but also there were a lot of really beautiful themes about sort of growing up and sort of the beauty and the wonder of imagination and playing pretend. A big part of the book is about the characters sort of learning that growing up doesn't mean having to kill your inner child. Basically, it doesn't mean having to kill your imagination. You can still love stories. You can still love pretend, and this sort of journey that they go on together is almost kind of their last gasp before this transitory period into adulthood or teenagerdom or whatever. And in that sense, I thought it was really, really beautiful. And there's some beautiful lines in there. There's some beautiful bits of dialogue. Obviously, it's a short book and it's for younger readers, so it's not, don't expect like a masterpiece or anything, but for what it was, and especially, for spooky times, I really, really enjoyed it. And it's also illustrated as well by it's illustrated by Eliza Wheeler, and they're very sort of cartoony, but they're also a little spooky as well. Let me if you can see there. So yeah, if you really like children's horror, that's a little bit spooky, a little gothic, but also has a lot to do with imagination and playing pretend and all that stuff, I would recommend it. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. And then for the final book that I read this month, this is the big boy. This is the one that took me like 2 months to finish, and it was the reason I only read 3 books last month, because I was so focused on it. That is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I had never read a single thing by Alexandre Dumas before. I'd always wanted to, and I always wanted to read this story in particular, but I was always intimidated by it because it's fucking huge. It's over 1,200 pages in this Penguin edition. And, being that it's an older novel, I was sort of intimidated by it from that sense as well. I was like, oh, it's a classic. It's going to be creaky and stodgy and boring. It was amazing. It really was. I was shocked. I mean, because remember, I don't read longer books usually. That's kind of, I tend to stay away from them. I read this in 2 months, which for me is like crazy. A 1,200-page book in 2 months with like really tiny print. I just flew through it. It was amazing. I'm sure if you're a fan of literature at all, you know the story, but it's about a guy named Edmond Dantes who's falsely imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and then escapes, finds a fortune, and comes back into Parisian society as the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo, at which point he starts to get revenge on those who wronged him. It's a classic story, and I can see why now. I loved it. All the themes of revenge and righteousness, divine providence, and there's so many characters and subplots, but it's all interesting. And one of the things that I really loved was the way that Dantes orchestrated everything, in that he doesn't usually get directly involved in the characters' downfall, but he sort of lets them hoist themselves on their own petard, as it were. He lets their sins come back to haunt them, and I thought that was fascinating, the way he sort of slips into this role of avenging angel. And there was so many things that I loved about it. Like it was action packed. It was exciting. There was betrayals and double crosses. There was murder. There was poisonings. And it all just fit together so beautifully. I loved it. I could talk about it for ages. Like, my friend Nakia, during the whole time I was reading it, I would message her like the day after reading a big chunk, and I'd be like, I have to tell you what happened in the book, because it was just so amazing. I just flew through it. I loved it. It was so good. And there's a bunch of other little things too, little details that I loved, like the way that Dumas depicts Parisian society. There's a scene where, several scenes actually, where they go to the opera and nobody pays attention to the opera. They just gossip with each other, and I loved that, how he depicted that the opera is almost like this meeting place for idle gossip. And there was another beautiful scene earlier on in the book where two characters are visiting Italy for Carnival, and the way that he there's a whole chapter where it's just him depicting sort of a day of Carnival and then the end of Carnival, where they all get these mocolettos, these little candles that they carry through the streets, and as the clock strikes midnight, they all blow them out at once, and the way that he wrote about that was so beautiful and evocative, and I loved it. So yeah, I mean, I know this is rambly and it may not make a lot of sense, but there's so much. I mean, there's a reason the book is so big, because there's so much in it, and it's all worth talking about, I think. You know, I loved it. It was so good. I've got Dumas' Three Musketeers series ready to go, and I want to read that as soon as possible. I want to read everything he ever wrote. I've never responded to a classic this strongly, except maybe Frankenstein, especially not one this massive and gigantic, but I flew through it. It was amazing. It was lovely. I could talk about it for ages. So that was a great way to cap off the month. So yeah, those were the 8 books I read for the month of August, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll see you later. Bye.